Now it's time for Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And today I am joined with pastor and author of a number of books, including Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't. This is Gavin Ortlund. Thank you, Gavin, for joining us.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about your book. I'm really excited about it. It's going to be coming out in late October. Can you tell us, this is something that we always think about within the editorial world, is what's the felt need? So what is the felt need that your book is addressing?
Well, one of the things that I've experienced a lot in the last few years is friends who've deconstructed their faith, or Christian friends who are trying to help their other friends who've deconstructed their faith. There's actually this whole movement right now, which is really concerning of how common these stories are of deconstruction. And as I have listened to these testimonies, I've kind of had the feeling that there's some unique characteristics to some of these stories that are a little different from maybe some of the struggles people had 20 years ago. I think one of the things that's on my mind is just the sense of disillusionment that a lot of people have. And I don't think that calls for a totally new approach to apologetics, but I do think it should flavor things a little bit. And the way we make an approach can sometimes be more winsome for that particular kind of person who's really struggling. And so the book really draws attention to the sort of affective and emotional sides of these various different arguments for the existence of God, and trying to show not just that this is plausible, but also what is at stake. The emotional difference between a theistic worldview and a naturalistic worldview in which there's nothing beyond nature. That is profound. It's the difference the more I've thought about that, I really think it's the difference between beauty and enchantment on the one hand, and chaos and meaninglessness on the other, ultimately. And so I hope the book will be helpful for people who are struggling and working through these questions today. I know what it's like to struggle with those questions, and I really hope the book will kind of touch upon those needs.
Right. Well, I love the way that you've described your book. And I know that the book actually reimagines four classical theistic arguments in order to appeal to the heart and imagination, or the beauty and enchantment, as you were saying. In what way does your book kind of reimagine these arguments?
Okay, so in each case, I go through these four arguments, and in each case, I'm trying to show what is at stake here. Emotionally, but that's kind of too small of a word. Just the full implications, what actually is the consequence either way you go. So the book starts with a cosmological argument, which is the argument for God as the first cause of the universe. And it's trying to say it's much more plausible to have a cause, like a personal God. But then I spend the second half of the chapter saying it's much more interesting. It leads to a much more expansive worldview. I think I used the metaphor at one point of it's as though you spent your whole life in the basement. You've never been outside. You didn't know that there were waterfalls or trees or stars. And then one day you see a staircase and you see light creeping through the bottom of the door, and you think, what could be out there? Anything could be out there. And I say, that's like what it feels like to go from a naturalistic to a theistic worldview. You go from this cramped, restricted thing to this absolutely massive world of possibilities. And then I do the same thing with other arguments. The argument for God from design, I say, enhances the sense of nobility and dignity to the world. The argument for God from morality enhances the sense of the meaning of our lives and the moral struggle we all face. And it gives hope. And then the last argument, I say, basically for human happiness and for the hope of history, makes all the difference. Do we believe in an afterlife or not? And ultimately, that makes a profound difference for whether life is even worth living. And I don't think that affective or emotional side of things is enough in and of itself, but I think joining that with the rational side really adds something potent to the whole appeal. I know it does for me, at least.
Right. And I love that you've separated things into different chapters so that you're able to focus on each theme. So you have the cause of the world, the meaning of the world, the conflict of the world, and the hope of the world. So let's just dive into one of those and let's talk about the conflict of the world. How would you use the conflict of the world when talking with someone who either is in the middle of kind of just unpacking their faith and kind of deconstructing it, or someone who is at least open to exploring the possibility of faith?
Mhm. Well, first, I just draw attention to the fact that all of us have this profound sense of good and evil, and that the difference between them really matters. Most people don't need to be argued into that. Most people can accept that, yeah, there are some things that are good, there are some things that are evil, and it the difference between those two is really significant. And I spend some time drawing attention to that through literature, through philosophy, through movies. So, one of the interesting clues about morality comes in the stories we tell. All cultures tell stories, and our culture's dominant form of storytelling is probably movies. And it's just interesting. It's so common, we don't even think about it. But every movie is about good and evil.
Mhm.
And it has the same pattern over and over. Good and evil are fighting, and eventually good triumphs over evil. And so then the question becomes, okay, so we've got this sense, all human beings have this set of moral instincts that through which we look at the world. And then we ask, well, what's the best explanation for that? And it turns out, in a naturalistic worldview, these feelings of morality are kind of an illusion. It's just something fobbed off on us by the evolutionary process that helped animals survive. But there's actually no, what we think of great, terrible atrocities in human history. And they're really not qualitatively different from in the animal kingdom when a stronger animal devours a weaker animal. That's just the way the world works. But on a theistic worldview, we're able to look at good and evil and see that they are significant, that feeling of significance isn't an illusion. That's actually a clue to the meaning of the world. And I find that not only more plausible, but more hopeful. I really find it unlivable. And I think most people would if they really trace it through and think through the implications. If you really arrive upon a full blown nihilistic worldview where there's no transcendent deity or supernatural reality, the moral conflict of the world really does reduce down to something I think very few human beings can even accept because it's so dark. And so this is just one of the reasons, as I've worked through these things in my own life at a personal level, I'm so profoundly grateful for my Christian faith. It gives me categories by which to make sense of the world that it makes more sense of the world, but it's also so much more emotionally satisfying.
Right. Well, you talk about what it would look like, or what we would expect from a naturalistic worldview as far as good and evil and what they mean. But what would we expect to see then from a Christian worldview?
Well, we would think of good and evil as real, significant categories that reflect the character of God.
Mhm.
So good is objective because it reflects His character and therefore His will for us. So when we feel a deep indignation at injustice, that's not an illusory feeling. There's a reason why we feel that way, and that feeling is totally valid. And I think someone who's a naturalist will have those feelings as well. But the difference will be, do you have a worldview that makes sense of them at both an intellectual and at an emotional level?
Well, thank you so much. There's so much more to learn about these topics, and I really hope that people will pick up your book. But first, how can they find you and find out more about your writings?
Yeah, thank you so much. Two ways. One would be on YouTube. I run a YouTube channel called Truth Unites. I've just started it a little less than a year ago, and I do apologetics work on there and also ecumenical dialogue and theology. And then I also have a website at just gavinortland.com, and people can find out about books and where I'm at on social media and those kinds of things on my website.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. So, viewers, if you want to find out more about this topic, look for Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't. Gavin Ortlund's book that's coming out in late October, wherever you can buy your books.